class tonight. We are in 2 Samuel, chapter 18, and verse 19. 18-19. Remember back in chapter 17, Absalom is in Jerusalem, having just come in after David runs for his life, he and his men. And Ahithophel gives Absalom one set of advice on how to handle this military situation with David. And Hushai, who is actually on David's side, gives him other advice to counteract Ahithophel's advice. And upon hearing the possibility that he might follow the good advice, which means an immediate strike with a force of 12,000 men with the sole purpose of killing David, which would, of course, hopefully cause all the rest of the people to come back to Jerusalem and support Absalom, David flees to Mahanaim, all the way from here, all the way up here, across the Jordan River, with his men. And then we get to chapter 18. Absalom crosses the Jordan River with his army, and they meet David's army in the field, and Absalom's army is routed. A loss of some 20,000 men, the Bible tells us. And that's in verses 14 and 15 of chapter 18. And then at the end of the chapter, we learn about Absalom's monument that he had made to himself because he wasn't sure that his sons were going to do it for him. And that brings us up to where we are in verse 19. Absalom has been defeated. David and his men have been victorious. And on the battlefield, Joab wants to send the message of the great victory to David up in Mahanaim. And there's a courier appointed to do that in verses 19 through 23. Joab refuses to grant the request of Ahimaaz to take the good news to David because the news of Absalom's death would not be good news to David. Now, who is this Ahimaaz? You remember him? He was the son of Zadok, the priest, whom David sent along with Jonathan, who was the son of the other priest, to spy for him in Jerusalem. That's where that name hopefully rings a bell with you. That's in, I think, 2 Samuel 15. He was supposed to keep David informed of what Absalom was up to. And his desire to take the news is probably prompted by the feeling that David will be as happy about the outcome of the battle as he is, because they absolutely routed Absalom's army evidently fairly easily. Now, there's a question of whether Ahimaaz knew that Absalom was dead or not. So keep that in mind as we go just a little bit further. But Joab says, no, you're not going to take that message. He probably remembers that David had executed a couple of messengers who had brought news of both Saul's death and Ishbosheth, who was Saul's son, his death. You remember when David got the news? He executed both of them, and he may have feared that this Ahimaaz, who was a valued member with David in his army, might suffer the same fate. But anyway, Joab in verse 21 appoints a Cushite to be the courier. He passes over all of Joab's personal friends. To send a slave was proof that the message was not probably going to be received very well. It was the custom, by the way, I found out in studying for this, that if you brought extraordinarily good news to the king, you were rewarded. If you brought bad news, you weren't rewarded. Let's just leave it at that. So he appoints appoints a Cushite to be the courier, and or he might have just simply picked him because he was a foreigner, and if the worst came to worst, he would rather lose him than lose Ahimaaz to David's wrath when he got the news. Okay, in verse 22 and 23, Joab was again approached by Ahimaaz, who was extremely eager and determined to be the one to carry the good news of the battle result to David. And Joab asked him a question: why do you want to be the messenger of news that might upset David? But he says, since you are determined to go ahead and go. After he begged for the permission to go in verse 23. And actually he sends both men. The Cushite was apparently already gone. And then Ahimaaz comes and asks Joab again, please let me go. And he says, okay, go. Well, Ahimaaz gets there, apparently we'll learn, before the Cushite did, because he took a quicker route. Verses 24 through 27, we move the geography up to Mahanaim, where David and his men are. And they have set a watchman at the gate, waiting for what? Probably the news. Now, of course, they generally had a watchman, but they was looking out probably especially for news of the outcome of the battle between Absalom's men and David's men. And we find that David was seated between the two gates. There was a double gate at the entrance to the city, and there was a second floor that had a room in it, and that's apparently where King David was sitting, probably looking out over the walls, anxious to find out about how the outcome of the battle was. He finds in verse 25, he calls out, with the watchman does, with news of the first courier. And David said, you know, the news is going to be good because he's alone. Now, if he had a bunch of men with him who were running, what would you think? That they had been routed, okay, and that they were retreating. But it's just one man. So he says, well, the news is going to be pretty good. And then he calls out, the watchman does, with news of a second courier, who is the Cushite. And again, David felt, since it was just a single man, that this is going to be the same way it was with Ahimaaz. It's going to be good news. He called out to the first courier. He called out that the first courier ran like Ahimaaz, and thereby David was convinced in verse 27 that the news was good. Okay, the first report in verse 28 was brought to David by the first fellow that got there, Ahimaaz. And he shouted out in verse 28 that all is well. The Hebrew for that word is shalom, which is part of Absalom's name. And it is almost identical with Solomon's name. His name is man of peace. And shalom means peace. So he gave the momentous news to David that the Lord had defeated his enemies. And then David's first and only question after the courier got there was, is it well with the young man Absalom? He didn't ask, how many men did we lose? Where is the army now? Is everything okay? What about Absalom's army? All the military and tactical questions that you might think that the king, as commander-in-chief, would want to know. All he wanted to know is the young man Absalom well. Well, Ahimaaz kindly sidesteps the question and doesn't give a direct answer, or he may not have had the news relayed to him about what had happened to Absalom, who was, remember, hung in a tree and then pulled down and then put in a pit and then covered with rocks. So, David asked him, I want you to step aside then, and I want to talk to the second man, the Cushite. He said, the Lord has delivered David in verse 31. He said, let's read it. Let my Lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. And the king asked the Cushite, well, how did we do in the battle? Or how many men did we lose? His question is it well with the young man Absalom? Same question. That's in verse 32. Verse 33, the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the... In other words, David knew what the man was saying. He didn't have to tell him directly that Absalom, your son, is dead. When he said in verse 32, let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you, well, he did mention him too, I'm sorry, be as that young man. And of course, David knew who he was talking about. And David was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate, that's that double city gate. And thus he said as he walked, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you? Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Now, next, verse 33. Chapter 19, verse 1. David is up in that room, weeping and wailing and mourning over the death of his son, and the army is now arrived. They hear what David is, his grief. They hear his mourning, that the only thing David cares about is what? What happened to his son. Not how many casualties did we suffer. How were my commanders? He cared about one person, and apparently cared about one person only in this situation. And David's unrestrained mourning was reported to David's military commander, Joab. And verse 2 through 4 tells us that David's mourning had a negative effect on David's army. They went back into the city as if they were ashamed of what they had done in verse 3. They saw David's face covered in verse 4 and heard his cries from his quarters as they marched into the city. So what should have been a great celebration of apparently an easy victory turned out to be something that they felt that they had disgraced, or that they had been soundly defeated, and they were ashamed of what had happened out there on the battlefield because one man had died. And you know what those men probably wanted as far as the fate of Absalom? What do you think they wanted to happen? They wanted him dead. Because he was the reason, he was the threat to David, their king and commander. So their first wish was to see Absalom dead, the leader of the rebellion. Well, Joab got hot about what David was doing in verse 5 through 7. And he charged David that he had shamed and humiliated his troops with his loud mourning and grief, that he loved those who hated him, Absalom, and that he hated those who loved him, his own men. He said that's the message that your grief and your actions are sending to your men and my men. In verse 6, the last part, that he was acting as though his men meant nothing. And that verse is worth a read. It says, for you have shown today that princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know this day that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. And that's how the men took it. That's how the men, when you come back from a rout and you have, in essence, saved the kingdom, is what you've done, then there should be a celebration, a big celebration. Instead, it turned out to be like a funeral, thanks to David. Joab in verse 7 tells David to get off your seat and go out there and encourage those men. And that's what David does. He says, if you don't do this, in the last part of verse 7, these men out here are on the verge of deserting you. And you're going to be left without an army, and you're going to be left without a kingdom, or we'll find another king. So David accepted Joab's, shall we say, rebuke, took his place at the city gate, where the troops were then recalled and they then marched victoriously in front of David back into the city of Mahanaim.
I don't think Joab ever gets over this either,
No,
because he takes the next opportunity to help try to set up a different king.
yes, he does. Another one of David's sons. Yes.
And I think it's David's reaction here, although the man who had refused to kill Absalom told him exactly, he told him that David would not be happy about this.
Right.
But had they left Absalom alive, everything tells us he would have risen up again.
As soon as he had the chance. Yes. And that would have meant that all of his residual followers would still be there helping him. They're trying to start another revolt.
Lloyd is absent, the one that was hired, caught in the tree as he rode under on the donkey.
Yes.
Killed.
Yes, and then Joab and his men killed him there. Yes. Killed him as he hung in that tree. Yeah. That was right after the battle, or during the battle, yeah. Verse 9. David leaves the city of Mahanaim across the Jordan River, heads south, and then across the Jordan River is his ultimate goal to get back to Jerusalem. But then the people of Israel, the northern tribes, and the southern tribes, but particularly here in this instance, the northern tribes are sitting back considering, well, let's see. The leader of the rebellion, Absalom, is dead. David's status is, as far as we know, still up in the air. Well, what about the kingship? Where are we here? What's the status? What's next? What do we do now? Okay, and then they probably began to look at one another and said, what about the reprisals from David? Because David had won. And that's probably what they were sitting around thinking. What are we going to do now? For those who sided with Absalom, they began to squirm. Verses 9, David begins negotiations to reunite the nation. In verses 9 through 10, the tribes of Israel debated the issue of supporting David. They said, Absalom is dead. David led us on many victories. What do you think we ought to do? And perhaps the leaders were hesitating in this manner because they feared what David might do to them. They recounted David's past victories in verse 9, and the conclusion is verse 10. Since Absalom is dead, there's really no realistic alternative. They're going to have to support David. David then initiated negotiations with Judah, his tribe, the southern part of the kingdom. So David asked the priests Zadok and Abiathar to represent him. And he says, I want you to represent me by informing the leaders that all the other tribes were now supporting him. David had either heard the rumors of the movement for him to be restored as king, or he had actually been in touch with those tribes, which is probably the situation. In verse 11, David now asks, now that Absalom was dead, why has no one organized a special effort to bring me back to Jerusalem as king? What are we waiting on? Who was the rightful king? David was. Okay? The rebel Absalom is dead. Why haven't I been contacted about being brought home and reinstated as the king of Israel?
The elders of his own tribe.
Well, yeah. And what tribe has been the ringleader in this rebellion? Judah. With Absalom recruiting mainly from Judah. So that accounts for part of the reluctance of them to say, David, we'd love to have you come back. Because they're again thinking of reprisals. Because they were instrumental in leading this rebellion. But I think by inviting them to take the lead, David was signaling that there was not going to be any reprisals against anybody. We just need to get the nation back together again. In fact, a little bit later, the men of the northern tribes would criticize the men of Judah by claiming that Israel, not Judah, was the first to suggest that we need to bring David back as king. And it did come from the north, not from Judah. Okay, verse 12. David reminded them, Judah, that they were his brothers. Why were you the last to bring me back? You should have been the first. You are my tribe. Second, he told Zadok and Abiathar to offer the position of army commander to Amasa. What was Amasa's last post? Anybody remember? He was the army commander for Absalom. Chapter 17, verse 25. Now, if that's not holding out an olive branch to the opposition, I don't know what is. Amasa, I want you to come lead my army. And remember, John, you mentioned how he was probably upset at Joab. This is probably the, sir? It does. It does show us how upset he was with Joab. Because Joab was actually the one responsible for the death of Absalom. And the criticism after the army got back of David's mourning over the loss of Absalom.
He puts the commander of the enemy troops.
Yes, the commander of the enemy.
In place of Joab.
Yes, yes. And he puts him in place of Joab here. Now, what should have happened to Amasa?
Amasa should have died for the rest of
He
it.
should have been executed for treason. Is what should have happened. Yeah, well, along with many,
David basically says that Joab's treason to him was worse than Amasa's treason was.
yes, yes. But I think appointing Amasa would signal that everybody that supported Absalom, you can come home. There won't be any revenge taken against any of you. And having Amasa on your side will also help in regaining the confidence and the influence of all of those in the tribe of Judah. So, David succeeded in his strategy in verse 14, and all the men of Judah hearts went back to David, and they invited him to come back and to be established again as king. David returned in verse 15. He came as far as the Jordan River, where the tribe of Judah met him down there to escort him across the river and back to Jerusalem. And then a fellow that we've met before also comes down there to meet David, named Shimei, or Shemiah.
I'm surprised he had not beat a trail
Out of here.
out there.
Out of Dodge. Kimball was the gentleman who went along the ridge throwing rocks, dust, and insults at David and his men as they left Jerusalem, running from Absalom. Yes, this is the same guy. And you remember, Abishai wanted to have his head cut off. And David said, no, that's probably God giving me what I'm due. Just leave him alone. But this time, Shemiah, that's the way it's pronounced, is singing a different tune. Would you be?
And if he didn't have a company of 1,000 Benjamites with him,
Yes, I was going to mention that.
probably might not have forgiven him.
Yes.
Forgive him at this
Yeah,
time.
he had 1,000 members of his own tribe with him, probably to try to save his hide if necessary.
That's Calvary.
Huh?
That was his Calvary.
That was his cavalry.
Once again, all accounts were not settled at this time.
No, they will be settled down the road a little bit. Okay. Shemiah was scared to death that David was going to kill him, and David said, nobody's going to die this day. In verse 17, we find another man joins the crowd down at the Jordan River named Ziba. Who is he?
That had report is that Mephibosheth had
Didn't come with David?
right, had left and thought he was going to be king again.
Yes,
That was the report he had given.
yes. He had told David earlier, because David asked, where's Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son? He should be going across the Jordan River with me, out of Jerusalem. Where is he? Oh, he's back in Jerusalem. They're going to make him king. And David says, okay, all the land of your master Saul is now yours. He was Saul's servant. We've run across, this is the third time we've run across this gentleman. By the way, the information is in chapter 16, first 4 verses. And let's see, hold on just a minute. 17. Okay. Doesn't say what Ziba was up to, but I think we know what he was up to. He was trying to reinstate himself with
When we hear the rest of the
story.
we can kind of fill in pieces.
Put it all together, yeah. Okay, verse 18, we find that thousands are down there helping King David cross over the Jordan. And I've got a note in my side here. I wonder if it was rafts that were going back and forth, like a ferry, going back and forth, because it says that, let me read. My translation led me to believe that. They kept crossing the ford to bring over the king's household and do what was good in his sight. And I wondered if they weren't waiting, W-A-D-I-G, then they were probably using rafts to bring all of David's supplies and people over. But anyway.
Well, my translation says ferry boat.
Yours says ferry boat?
They're
Oh, okay.
one crossing here over the king's household.
Oh, okay. What translation you got? NIV?
Yes.
NIV, okay.
Yes.
ESV.
Even after New King James Version.
New King James. Okay, all right.
Lord, how big a body of water was that?
Jordan River, it's not very wide. It's not very wide.
Except the floods.
Except in the, spring floods. That's the only time. Otherwise, it's probably not over, 20 feet across, 30 feet across? I call it a stream. Yeah. Okay. Shemias, we find out that he's asking for mercy and forgiveness in verses 18 through 20. He acknowledged his sin. He says, I am the first of the house of Joseph to come down here to meet you. To what group of people is he referring when he says Joseph? I am the first of Joseph. Israel. Joseph, if you'll notice in the 10 tribes, is not mentioned. Why? He was given a double portion because the Levites didn't get a share.
The northern tribes were later on called Ephraim.
Yes, he had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And those 2 sons were both given a share and became part of the 10 tribes. So Joseph here is used because it's the most powerful tribe as a name for the entire 10 tribes, the north.
That was Jacob that performed that, wasn't it?
Sir?
Was Jacob the one that gave those 2 tribes to Ephraim and Manasseh?
He may have. Genesis 49. I might need to check that. When he gave his blessing.
And that's where he crossed his hands?
Yeah.
That's where he crossed his hands.
Yes, in regards to the blessing. Yeah. Okay, again, with Shemiah, Abishai says, I want to go cut his head off. This is the second time Abishai has made the same suggestion about the same man. Verse 21. But David says, no. Verse 22, I like the way he puts it in my translation. Somebody else might want to give me another one. What do I have to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? His sister. Yes. In other words, you and I aren't on the same thinking plane here. This is not a day for killing. This is a day for celebration, I think is his idea. Yeah, verse 22, that's what he said. So he said that Shemiah would be forgiven, mercy toward him, and he would be allowed to live. So, yes, John?
I think this was an insult all three times he said that, because he called them by a woman's name, not their own name.
He really upset David. They did, his half-brothers. Let's see, the first one was killed by Abner. Help me with the name. Asahel. Yes. And then there was Joab and Abishai. Yeah. All three became thorns in David's side at one time or another. So, verses 24 through 30, David's going to correct an injustice which was done to Mephibosheth as he was fleeing Jerusalem after he got the message that Ziba wanted him to know, Ziba. Verse 24, Mephibosheth's appearance looked like, if you read your description in there, that he had been in a deep mourning for what had happened to David. David asked Mephibosheth, "Why didn't you come with me when we fled from Absalom out of Jerusalem?" And Mephibosheth's answer was that he, being lame, had tried to join David by riding his donkey, but that Ziba had apparently betrayed him, soon by stealing his donkey and riding it himself. And he charged his master Ziba with slandering him before the king. Had Ziba done that? Exactly what he had done. Remember, he told David, Mephibosheth sitting back in Jerusalem hoping they'll make him king since you've left. So he cast his fate in verse 27 into David's hands, and he acknowledged two facts in verse 28, that David had already spared his life and given him far more than he deserved, and that he had no right to ask any more of the king than David had already done for him. And there's a part in verse 8 that I like here. For all my father's household was nothing but dead men before my lord the king. Now, who was his father's household? Saul and his family, okay? Now, what happened normally to the men of the preceding kingship or kingdom when they had been defeated? They were generally killed. And that's why he calls them we were as dead men. We were as, I guess we would say today, we were as good as dead. David, however, had shown great kindness to Jonathan and his sons, while Saul, of course, had mercilessly chased David for how many years? 7 years? I think it was 7 years that David was on the run down there in Judah. And so David makes a third decision about what's going to happen with Saul's property. Mephibosheth and Ziba were to divide the land, because I guess David didn't know which one was telling the truth. And I really don't have time to hold the court here and call witnesses to try to figure this out. Because it's a, he said, she said. So he said, I'll tell you what, this is the third time, let's just split it 50-50. And probably David was thinking, I hope this is the last I hear between Ziba and his master Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth humbly submitted in verse 30 to David's judgment. And let's stop right there. Any questions? It's 8 o'clock. We didn't get to the chapter. I apologize. I'm going into too much detail, apparently. Don't tempt me. Yeah, right. Do what?
It was a busy chapter.
It was a
Lots of details.
busy chapter. Did we have anybody killed tonight? Except 20,000 of Absalom's men? Now, they died last Wednesday night. That was last Wednesday night. We didn't have anybody killed this week.
Nobody should have died this week.
Because it was a big celebration.
I wonder,
Yeah.
They tried several times.
Yeah, you're right. They tried. Butch?
You hear now people say today sometimes when you got bad news, don't kill me, I'm just a messenger.
Yeah. It very well could. That's why he didn't want Ahimaaz to go, because he was afraid David would kill him. The Cushite was a foreigner and a slave, and said if David gets angry enough about this, at least he'll kill somebody that's not all that high up the ladder in ascension, because he's just a slave. Yeah.
Did you say there, though, that it was good news, they were happy, that
Yeah.
good news, and they-
Yeah, if it was good news, sometimes they would give them a reward. Yeah. And so he didn't want to send Zadok's son in there with a message about, and that makes me think that Joab thought that Ahimaaz knew that Absalom was dead. But when Ahimaaz got there, he hemmed and hawed about it and didn't want to tell David. Remember, he sidestepped the question.
He lied.
He lied.
He knew, but he lied.
He misspoke.
He said it right there that,
He
he said,
Yeah, that's this guy sitting behind
I
that.
didn't know anything about it, it was a lie.
Oh, that's good. That is good. Boy, it was tough times back then. If you were a higher up in one of these kingdoms. Any more questions or
It
comments?
was a tougher time if you were not. Well, this was, if you were lower down, worse if not.
Yes. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word, and we appreciate the lessons that we can take from this and see how, Father, that you deal with those that you love. We pray, Father, that we will be those that you love and will act in that way and learn from this message in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.